Who would flee a drug-infested, war-torn country, walk thousands of miles, pay their life savings to a coyote, risk their lives and their kids' lives to cross the border and commit a crime? When you look at those people, the story you need to tell yourself is the story of your family's journey to this country.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Talking Politics with Mom, where I, a progressive millennial, talk to my formerly conservative boomer mom about politics. So, Donald Trump ran his 2024 campaign for president focused essentially on a single issue: immigration, specifically how illegal immigration, quote unquote, is destroying America. According to him, illegal immigrants are responsible for basically all of America's problems. Demonizing immigrants is, of course, how he infamously began his 2016 campaign.
They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists.
And in the last election, he doubled down on that narrative. Not only were illegals bringing drugs and crime, they were even eating your cats and dogs. But not only that, they were driving up the cost of housing, stealing your jobs, driving down your wages, leeching off your hard-earned tax dollars, stealing government benefits from you, bringing disease and overwhelming the hospitals. But more importantly, they were poisoning the blood of our nation, transforming our culture and values, replacing us. It was an invasion. Hordes of nameless and faceless brown people forming caravans, infesting our country, invited in by the Democrats to steal the election for their communist plot to destroy America. And this is not just hyperbole. This is the kind of stuff that was being said.
They're poisoning the blood of our country. That's what they've done. They poison mental institutions and prisons all over the world.
But instead of providing an effective and affirmative counter-narrative, the Democrats said, well, we tried to do something about it, but Trump wouldn't let us, which, to be fair, was true, and we'll get into some of that later. But this approach also reinforced Trump's narrative, because if your big concern is being tough on the border, who are you going to vote for? You're going to vote for Donald Trump. And they did. They did vote for him, unfortunately, and soon he will be president again. And now we have to face the very real possibility that he will follow through on his promise of mass deportation, something that he has described as a bloody story with no price tag, that he is prepared to use emergency powers in order to facilitate, an endeavor that I truly believe will tear this country apart. But there is another story to tell about immigration, and it's frankly the origin story at one point or another of the vast majority of Americans. There is a different vision that can be presented, a vision about how immigration can fuel and enrich our country and all of us. Because the truth is, we've seen this demonization before. We've heard these lies before with basically every immigrant group that's come into this country, including my ancestors. And so today, my mom and I are going to explore what an effective and affirmative counter-narrative about immigration might look like. Now, we recorded this episode before the right-wing civil war broke out between the tech billionaires and the MAGA base, a fight that I think reveals the grift at the heart of the story being deployed by the billionaire class and their enablers in the Republican Party. But everything we talk about here is relevant to that situation, and I'm going to share some thoughts on that whole debacle at the end of this video, because there's perhaps no better time to present a better, more accurate, more hopeful vision for the role of immigration in America than when the right wing is busy fighting amongst themselves. But before we start, please consider subscribing to our YouTube channel so you can get notified when a new episode comes out, and or supporting us on Patreon where you can get early access to future videos, bonus clips, pictures, and a bunch of other fun stuff. All right, let's get into it. Hi, Mom.
Hello, child.
So we decided that today we were going to talk about immigration. It played heavily in the last election. Donald Trump's lies about immigration, his demonization of immigrants, I think was a big part of his victory. What we saw in the last election was that there was not a good counter narrative to what Donald Trump was selling.
Right.
So today we're going to try and explore what a counter narrative might look like. And to start, I thought we'd get real specific. And I wanted to ask you about our family's immigration story, and specifically the story of your grandmother.
Yeah, immigration is a really painful subject, seeing what happened in the last election. And it's been always very close to my heart because we were an immigrant family and we were very close to, especially the Italian side. On the other side, I had Irish and Polish. They were probably potato famine Irish. And my grandmother, who was first generation born here of Polish and Russian Jews. I don't know a lot about their story. I know much more about my mother's story. I do know that the Irish were, lived 13 to an apartment. We know that from the census. And we know that TB took the lives of a lot of them because they lived in such terrible conditions. On the Italian side, though, my grandparents were both immigrants from Italy. So I know more about that. My grandmother was born in a tiny little village in the mountains. It is a unbelievably beautiful place. And people fled by the thousands from that region at the turn of the century because of famine. And you can see in the immigration books of the municipality there, where the records go back a couple of hundred years, in the margins of my family, their birth records, in the margin it says America. And you go down the list of that page, America, 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 as that region emptied out to escape starvation. My grandmother was a tiny little thing. She clearly had malnutrition problems because her legs were bent and she walked with a pronounced limp her entire life. She, as a young girl, climbed the mountains in search of firewood for her family. Her brother went to America first, and he found work, and then he came back and started to bring his family over. He cut a deal with a German family. My grandmother was going to be an indentured servant, and so she got on a boat when she was either 13 or 14 years old. How she did this, I have no idea. To go from the mountains, where they spoke a dialect that almost no one else in Italy could understand, and somehow make it to the coast of Italy, I have no idea how she did it. She got on the boat. She came to New York. She did already speak German because a lot of people in that region spoke German. And she was indentured to that family for 5 years. Then her brother was cutting a business deal, and he basically sold her to a business associate of his as a bride. She never met the man before she got married. And all I can say about my grandmother is she was the bravest, toughest, kindest, funniest person, who affected my entire life. I got through some very rough patches of my childhood because of my grandmother, her absolute unconditioned love. The circumstances of her life would have broken most people. To be ripped away from your family, she was one of like 9 children or 13 children, some enormous number of kids, and sent on a boat by herself to a strange country where she basically didn't know anybody, and be thrust into this city, like this booming city with people from everywhere in the world. I can't even imagine the culture shock she must have had. But she was determined to make something of her life. She was determined that her children would not face the kind of obstacles that she had faced. And she did it with so much joy. I mean, they always were going to parties. They went to the big parties of the people of the mountains in New York where they sang. She just was not going to be deterred, not by an alcoholic husband with a violent temper. She just wasn't going to be deterred. She wanted her kids to be Americans. She was illiterate. She didn't read. She didn't write. My mother had to translate for her in school, but she just flowed around obstacles like water.
What do you know about the specific obstacles that Italian immigrants faced during the time that your grandmother came to New York City?
Well, she came probably around the turn of the century. They don't like to talk about it, but my mother occasionally talked about it when we would get into arguments, about her views on other things. And she said, "You don't know what it was like," which was true. She said, "You don't know what it was like walking the streets, looking for a job, and seeing the signs, Irish need not apply, Catholics need not apply, Italians not welcome. You don't know what it was like to be, spit in your face and called a dago and, told to go back to your country and that you were trash and your mother was a prostitute and your father was a drunk and a criminal. And you don't know what it was like." She was right. I didn't. But she knew what it was like, and she never forgot. And some of the people my grandmother knew died in the shirtwaist fire in New York, which was mostly Italian seamstresses who were locked into the building with all the exits closed. They were garment workers, and the garments and all that dust caught fire, and they couldn't get out, and it was a terrible thing. I mean, the Italians retreated into themselves. They stayed in their own neighborhoods. They spoke their own languages. They had their own newspapers and radio stations, which had the ironic effect of preserving their language after it died out in Italy.
Right.
And stayed in New York. They created their own alternative economy. They created their own alternative world, and at least they had the Catholic Church to protect them. But it was not an easy life.
How did your mother carry and relate to her own Italian identity? Because she was 100%.
She was
Italian.
100%. She was 100%. I think I told you that when we went to school, Catholic school, you recited your heritage the way like Native Americans recite their clans. And people would say, "What are you?" And I always very proudly said, "My mother is 100% Italian." And I asked her later in life, "Why don't you ever call yourself an Italian American?" Because I call myself an Italian American. I'm only 50%. She said, "I'm not an Italian American. I'm an American of Italian extraction," which, as I told you, is impossible. Like you could extract the Italian from Tony Soprano, or you could never extract the Italian from my mother.
Yeah.
And I never understood that until I started reading, for completely other reasons, the history of World War I in this country. And here you have the President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, saying that hyphenated Americans, like my mother, Italian Americans, were traitors, that they carried around a knife and they were just waiting to stick it in the heart of America. No wonder she never wanted to be called an Italian American. She wanted to be called an American. And her name was very quickly anglicized by the family. She was born Ida Lucia, and she was always Edith Lucy to us, but her name is very beautiful in Italian. But in the 1930 census, I saw that she was Edith. She never wanted to look back. I mean, the only experience I ever personally had with discrimination against myself, and it's really a very minor incident, was when I was in the first grade, and I was too young to get into Catholic school. They were so overwhelmed with the kids of, the baby boom generation that they split the sessions. I wasn't old enough. So I had to go to public school for half a year. And I was definitely in the minority. Those kids did not let me forget it. I got called names. I got mocked for my appearance. They called me Italian slurs and stuff. And I went to my mother and I said, "They're calling me all these names." And she said, "Yeah, I got called those names too. Sticks and stones can break your bones, but names will never hurt you." That's what we always used to say. So she had it in her life, but she didn't care. She was so focused on being somebody, on being American, she wanted to be a doctor, on her study. She was really smart. She didn't let any of that stand in her way. Me, on the other hand, this happened to me when I was like 6. I had a secure family. I was not subjected to any of this anywhere else in my life, but I never forgot it. And I never forgave it. People think that hate has no price. Well, they're wrong.
Yeah, it's interesting because I reflect on like my own identity and, a few generations past, and I'm just a white guy. I'm a white American. I think it's cool that I'm part Italian, because being Italian is cool, and you know what
Now
I
it
mean?
is.
But
Yeah.
now it is. I never received any discrimination for my identity.
Right.
I'm just a white American.
Right.
And but not many generations past, my ancestors were being discriminated against for their ethnic and immigrant status.
Oh, they were. Not just your Italian ancestors, but on my side, your Jewish ones and your Irish ones. I mean, some of my ancestors, my sister reports, were what they called roughs. They got into gangs, the Irish ones. It was a self-protection thing. It's like West Side Story, you know? People banded together to protect themselves if they couldn't get protection from the police. Against the Irish, there was terrible discrimination.
Today, the descendants of Irish and Italian people are just white Americans. But when the Italians first came to America, they weren't necessarily considered to be white Americans.
Though they were definitely not considered to be white Americans. And what was interesting, this goes back to the founding of the Republic in 1790, where I don't know, it was part of the Alien and Sedition Act, but they said white people could become naturalized citizens. That was a law. That goes way back. That goes 200 years back. After we talked, and I was wondering what kind of world my Italian relatives lived in, I came across some information that I did not know, which was the origin of Columbus Day. Columbus Day was a big thing for us. My high school always marched in it. Every single class had to march in the St. Patrick's Day Parade and the Columbus Day Parade. He became the Italian who discovered America. He became part of America's origin story. So we were Americans now. We were very proud of that. What I didn't know was how Columbus Day came about. The first Columbus Day was in 1892, I think. Isn't that nice? Benjamin Harrison, the president, declared Columbus Day. Why did he do that? I mean, there were lots of Italians coming to the country. He did it to avoid a war with Italy.
Yeah.
Why was America about to be in a war with Italy? Because Italy cut off diplomatic relations with the United States. Why did Italy cut off relations with the United States? Because 11 Italians in New Orleans had been lynched by a mob because a sheriff had been murdered. They decided to blame the Italians. They arrested a whole bunch of them. Most of them were acquitted, and the other ones had a mistrial. That's how bad the evidence was, because the juries were all rigged then. A mob decided that they wanted their own revenge, and so they broke them out of the jail and they lynched them. And how did this happen? Did you even know there were Italians in New Orleans? After the Civil War, they were desperate for labor because the slaves had all been freed. So here come the Italians. They're willing to work for nothing. All these Italians flood into New Orleans. They have their own neighborhoods. They have their own presses. They have their own, businesses. They start selling to the Black community. They start intermarrying with the Black community. Louisiana decides that these Italians are Black. They say that they're inherently criminal, they're genetically inferior, and everything else that came in this country with with being Black. The white elite start to want their businesses. there's an economic downturn. The population considers them the same as blacks. When this sheriff is murdered by who knows, he was a bad guy and had hundreds of enemies. They just lit on the Italians, who were black people as far as they were concerned. They murder them, and the Italian government cuts off diplomatic relations with the United States. So if that hadn't happened, Benjamin Harris had to do something about it because we were about to go to war with Italy. And so all of us who are marching in the Columbus Day Parade had no idea that the reason that we were allowed in to the American origin story was that Italy stood up for its immigrants and told them basically we were going to go to war with the United States. And we had to back down and let all of those Italians into the white race. And it didn't happen overnight. I mean, the quotes in the story that I read from the New York Times about mongrels and how could you let these genetically inferior kids sit next to American children in schools? I mean, it was really vile, but still, that is the backstory of Columbus Day. So when you look at those immigrants coming to the border, just remember once upon a time, that was you.
The same vitriol and demonization that Trump and Trumpism shows to immigrants today, some version of it has happened to literally every immigrant group that has come to this country at some point or another.
Yeah, I want to read to you from the New York Times after those gentlemen were lynched. He said, Chief Hennessy avenged 11 of his Italian assassins lynched by a mob, which they were not. But they demonized them in the headlines so that when you find out that they were murdered by a mob, you don't care. It's like, oh, well, they had it coming to them anyway. These sneaky and cowardly Sicilians, the descendants of bandits and assassins who have transported to this country the lawless passions, the cutthroat practices, are to us a pest without mitigations. Our own rattlesnakes are as good citizens as they. Our own murderers are men of feeling and nobility compared to them.
Donald Trump might not put it in those words, but he basically is saying
He
the
came really
exact same
close.
thing.
Yeah. This is not the first time. This was what my family faced. It's amazing that they came out the other side.
Hey folks, Future Will here. I just wanted to comment on some recent news that this whole discussion made me think of, because over a century since this story we've been discussing, where an immigrant community was falsely accused of committing a crime in New Orleans, Donald Trump falsely claims that an immigrant committed this horrible crime in New Orleans. In fact, the person who committed this recent attack was a native-born citizen from Texas. But even beyond that similarity, the language that Trump used in telling this lie was eerily familiar to the language my mom just cited from the New York Times.
Our own murderers are men of feeling and nobility compared to them.
Trump wrote on Truth Social, "When I said that the criminals coming in are far worse than the criminals we have in our country, that statement was constantly refuted by Democrats and the fake news media, but it turned out to be true. As Mark Twain said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes." All right, back to the show. The story about Woodrow Wilson's attack on hyphenated Americans and how that caused your mother, who was first-generation Italian immigrant, to hold on tighter to her American identity.
She did.
In some ways it makes a lot of sense because it can separate you from the vitriol that's being showed to other folks.
Yeah.
And I think that gives us some understanding of what just happened in this last election, because part of the thing that confounded many people was that amidst all this demonization of specifically Latino immigrants, you had a rise in the vote share for Donald Trump from Latinos.
Yes. And that at first caused me great heartache because I thought, how can you forget How of you, of all people, can forget your origin story? How can you forget how Latinos have been demonized? How can you forget that? How can you not look at those people at the border and say, 25 years ago, that was my family. That was my uncle. That was my mother. That was my father.
Or that was me
Or
in
that
some
was me.
cases.
How can you forget that? Hearing immigrants who had been naturalized in this election say things like, we have to keep out the criminals. What criminals? So that was very shocking to me. But I understand a lot better now, because when we started this conversation a number of weeks ago, it was very painful to me. And so I really had to start thinking about it in terms of what I knew of my own family history. This is a part of a much broader narrative. So let's take a step back and try to understand it. And I'm going to move from what I know of my own family and then what I've learned later. And the first thing about my family is, in the first generation that came here, I don't think they were very political. I don't know that my grandmother ever registered to vote. She didn't think that way. She just wanted to live. And she knew the cards were stacked against her, and she didn't care, and she just figured a way around them. But the next generation of my aunts and uncles, every single one of them was a Republican. And then in the next generation, my generation, that's also true. But in your generation, it has come to a radical change in my nieces and nephews. And maybe that's the story of immigrants. The first generation who comes here struggles to make a living. Then they make it, and, some of them vote and some of them don't vote. It just depends. Depends on who helped them. The next generation, based on my family's experience, tends to be Republican. They want to identify as Americans. I want to start a business. I want to be in a business. I want to be successful. I want lower taxes. I want whatever. And I don't want those other people coming behind me. And then their kids kind of, probably now, with time being so compressed these days, with much more access to the internet and so on, it's probably their kids who will be able to step back and say, no, it's not right to pull up the ladder behind you. But the need to become American is so strong. The need to become part of the story of America is so strong. It kind of overwhelms people.
Right. And that's part of the irony of this whole situation, isn't it? Because in many ways they were being demonized as un-American, but really they just want to be seen as Americans. And I think about the thing that Donald Trump said when he first came down that escalator, and he said, they're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists. But then he also said, I assume some of them are good people. And I think for a lot of Latinos, they saw all of these attacks on immigrants and Latinos specifically, and they said, I don't want to be part of the group that's getting attacked that way.
Yeah.
I'm one of the good ones.
Yeah. I mean, I really don't know. I imagine that makes a lot of sense. But what bothered me about that when it happened 8 years ago was not that, it bothered me that Donald Trump said it, but Donald Trump is Donald Trump. He's going to say what he's going to say. What bothered me was that it landed on such receptive ears. That's what bothered me, because he'd probably been saying that for years and no one listened to him and no one cared. And they just blew him off because he was some TV reality show star and they didn't listen to him. But somehow, after Obama had been president for 8 years, and some people really didn't like that, not because of anything he did, but because of who he was, to have someone say what they were thinking, they're bringing crime, they're bringing drugs, that people listen to that is what bothered me more than that he said it. He'd said it for years, birtherism and whatnot. And if you remember, none of the people he was running against took that seriously. None of them thought he would win. None of them had the guts to stand up to him and say, how dare you attack people like this, immigrants like this? How dare you do that?
Right.
None of them did, because they didn't think it would stick. But it not only stuck, but people started chanting, build the wall, build the wall. And this is in a time of relatively economic prosperity. This kind of attack on immigrants and trans people and whatnot usually happens when there's a lot of economic insecurity and you need a scapegoat to blame. And the rich are like, don't blame us. Look at that guy over there sneaking across the border. He's the problem, not me and my fifth yacht. That's not the problem. But this was not a time of economic insecurity. People were very prosperous coming out of Obama's 8 years. This was people who were economically secure. It's like there's this demon that goes to sleep, and every 30 years or 20 years, it gets awakened by a demagogue who needs somebody to persecute for their own personal ends.
I mean, I think you're right about a lot of that. I think that in this last election, the affordability crisis does contribute to people being receptive to a scapegoat.
Yeah, it does.
It's not a full explanation. I mean, I think we've seen stats recently that Republicans, like 3 weeks ago, said that they were hurting financially, and Donald Trump's not even president, and the numbers have flipped like 100%. Now they say, oh, the economy is great. Donald Trump has changed it already. So there's a lot of nonsense when you're looking at these economic indicators. But it is true that there is an affordability crisis that's hitting a lot of people. And I think that does create some receptivity to an anti-immigrant message. So the demonization of immigrants is not new in America. You reminded me about Prop 187, which is actually a law that I remember. I think I even wrote an essay about it in middle school, but you were looking back into that law. What were some of the things that you were reminded of?
Okay, so, I'm feeling really bad about the election, and how could Hispanics vote for Donald Trump after all of the terrible things he said about their families? And how could anybody excuse that and overlook that? I felt really depressed about it. And then I had to start thinking, okay, when have I seen this before? First, of course, with Joe McCarthy. It wasn't immigrants, it was a different group, but the principles are the same. You find a vulnerable group, you attack them, you demonize them, you pretend that there are billions of them, and you throw a few people in jail and everyone feels better. And then I thought, wait a minute. I had been in California about, 20 years or more than 20 years. California was a very different place then. Think back, 1994. California is having some economic problems. They're having somewhat of a recession. 2 years before 1994, there were riots after the Rodney King verdicts came. So there was racial unrest. There's economic problems. And here comes this Republican with an initiative he calls Save Our State. And it's Proposition 187. And it basically says, if you're illegal, undocumented, whatever, you can't have a job. You can't have any social services, which they couldn't have anyway. You can't have any benefits. If someone suspects that you're an illegal in government, they have to turn you in. So the entire government apparatus is turned into spies under this initiative. If you are a teacher, you have to check the immigration status of every kid. So this initiative passed with 60% of the vote, which meant that I had to prove that you and your brother and sister were citizens before you could go to school. It never came to that because the court put an injunction on it, but that was the law. So I thought, wait a minute, okay, I have seen this before. I didn't remember that it passed by 60%. And
In
then
California.
I'm like, this is California, like 25 years ago. And so then I start looking into the details. This is the preamble. The people of California find and declare that they have suffered and are suffering economic hardship caused by the presence of illegal aliens in this state, that they have suffered and are suffering personal injury and damage caused by the criminal conduct of illegal aliens in this state. So then I looked at the exit polling. I'm like, who voted for this? I didn't vote for this. Every single county except the Bay Area counties voted for this. Los Angeles County, 58%. San Diego County, 67%. Places that are now Democratic strongholds. 52% of Black people voted for it. 27% of Latinos voted for it. 52% or more of Asians voted for it, even though they were the second biggest target. Then I looked even more. People with incomes of $40,000 and over, which was quite a bit of money then, voted for it in overwhelming numbers. I will say that Catholics did not vote for it. Good for us. But the thing that was the most interesting to me was first and second generation citizens. 52% voted for it. And third generation citizens, 60%. People not only become American very fast, they want to leave everything else behind as fast as they can. They want to deny that they were ever in that group of people trying to get in at the border. They want to erase their history. I mean, that's 60% of third-generation Americans voted for that. Is very instructive. This is not the first time. This is a pattern. Just like my mother said, I want to be American.
And why wouldn't you want to be seen as American when immigrants are constantly being demonized?
Yeah. I mean, with Donald Trump, we had 8 years nonstop with no counter narrative, no other story put forward that people could tell themselves about those people at the border. And so eventually it sinks in so that even Democrats are saying, yeah, it's just too much. I mean, to a certain extent, it was too much.
But the answer was you needed more immigration judges.
But there were answers, and there was certainly no story that they were telling.
That's right. In many ways, immigration policy is a question of national values, but there's also just the facts on the ground. Most people don't have a clear picture of what immigration policy and what's actually happened on the ground over the recent decades. Back when our family moved to the United States, immigration policy was sort of like, if you come here, you get to stay. I mean, there was
unless
the
you were Chinese.
Unless you were Chinese. There was the Chinese Exclusion Act. But modern immigration is a very different story. I thought we might actually discuss some of the facts on the ground when it comes to immigration. Let's start, with what you remember, like in the 80s, say.
Okay, so it really bothers me that my own story that I tell myself about what was happening at the border seemed to be completely at odds with what I believe about immigration. I treasure my family's own history, and I respect them so much for what they went through. And then hearing the words out of my own mouth that too many people are coming just seemed like wrong. There was something really wrong with that, even to my own ears. I'm like, am I a real hypocrite? So I felt like I had to go back and really look at what's going on. And when you don't really have a lot of information, you just tell yourself a story based on what you know, right? That's how we understand things. And the story I was telling myself was, yeah, there probably are too many people at the border. Joe Biden, for some reason, didn't do anything about it. And here we are. We've got to cut it back. I don't know why he didn't, but there are just too many people.
Right.
It just didn't sit right with me. So I did what I always do, which is I put on my lawyer hat. I'm like, I need to know the facts to see what part of my story is right and what part is wrong. And it's actually incredibly fascinating if it wasn't so terrible. If you really go back to like when I was in high school and immigration was not an issue at all for us, legal immigration in this country was basically zero. It was nothing. And then you see that it starts to go up. As the 60s hit and you have wars of revolution all over the world, as the old European empires collapse and the Vietnam War takes shape, immigration goes up and up and up. But then it starts going flat. But it's still not on my radar at all. And then I grow up and I have kids and we're in the 80s and we live in LA. And we all felt the effects of immigration to the country because Ronald Reagan was sending my tax money to these death squads in Central America who were terrorizing their countries and murdering the archbishop and murdering priests and nuns and anybody else that they felt like it under the auspices of protecting us all from communism. And people in the Central American countries that affected just swarmed to the United States. And if you look at the graph, it just goes skyrocketing in the 80s. After being pretty mellow, it was going up, but it just explodes in the 1980s as people are running for their lives, which they did. And of course, they landed in Los Angeles, a lot of them. And I do remember that. And I remember that there was an uptick in gang violence because when you have like that kind of chaos from some terrible event, usually war, and people are fleeing, the criminals always hop a ride in the chaos. And that happened. And there were gangs that added to the already immense number of LA gangs. And there was problems, even in the neighborhood. There was drugs starting to come in, the CIA and their cocaine money, however they got it here. I remember those times very well. And it was not nice. But there wasn't that much of an immigration backlash. We blamed Ronald Reagan because we knew that this was happening. Fast forward a little bit, like about 10 years, the economy goes south a little bit in the United States. You get Proposition 187 as a backlash in California, blaming immigrants because you always do. So it's not the first time you had a huge influx of refugees, basically, into a very small area in the United States, and it creates a backlash. There was a second surge of immigration about 7 years later because Clinton's economy was so good, and that pulls people towards it. And that was the second wave, but I don't remember anyone reacting to it. Then fast forward to Obama, elected in 2008. George Bush had made a hash of the economy. Everybody remember that the world economy basically collapsed?
Right. Yes. Yeah.
And so, we didn't have a very good economy, but everywhere else was worse. And Obama came in and he slammed the door. He was like, you are not coming here. He was the deporter in chief.
Yeah. Part of his calculation, I remember, was that he wanted to do a comprehensive immigration policy that was going to acknowledge the millions of people many of whom had been here for decades. And in order to try and strike that deal with the Republicans, he essentially said, okay, you guys are so worried about border security. I'm going to show you that I can do border security and then take you at your word for it. He was the deporter in chief. And then when it came to actually negotiating the deal, they couldn't get past the filibuster and nothing happened. And then he started to pull back a little bit and did DACA and DAPA. But, Obama was always negotiating with himself and actually trusted the Republican Party as though they were good faith actors.
Yeah, that was like Lucy with the football.
Yeah.
I'll cut a deal with you. Okay, you give in and then we'll take the football away.
Yes.
You can see the guy was never a trial lawyer.
Right.
Because you would never do that. You would
exactly.
show me your cards.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's true. And so what happens? He strengthens the border. He hires more agents. Immigration not only plummets to its lowest level since I was in high school, but people start to actually leave the United States. Like 1 million plus Mexicans nationals left during Obama's reign, we lost about 1.5 million undocumented people in the country. And the border was very strong and the levels were really low.
It was basically like a net zero immigration
Yeah,
at
it
that
was.
point.
Yeah. But what they didn't see under the radar, it was that even though the levels were lower, the composition of the immigrant population was changing. You were getting more families. It used to be when you said immigrants, you meant single guys from Mexico coming to work who would come, and then when the work was over, it was seasonal, usually they would leave, and then they'd come back. By the end of Obama's time in office, the immigrants coming here, there were a lot more people coming from Central America, and there were a lot more families. And they were coming to the border and asking for asylum.
Right.
So here comes Trump coming down the elevator, and he says, they're bringing crime, they're bringing drugs, we have this terrible crisis, build the wall. And people lost their minds, like, build the wall. He created that completely out of thin air.
Right.
Because actually what had happened was 1 million plus immigrants had left. The border was the lowest level it had been in decades. Obama had targeted criminals and new arrivals and caught them, jailed them, the criminals, and deported them. The whole mechanism of the border was actually very strong.
And the real problem that really needed to be addressed at that time was that you had undocumented people who had been here for a very long time, and they needed a pathway to citizenship. That was the problem that needed to be solved when at the end of Obama's term. And then Trump comes down and pretends like this thing is a problem, and it really isn't a problem in America at that time.
No, it wasn't a problem at all. The economy was good. Immigration was extremely low. And the border security was good because Obama had improved it. Just like Trump inherited Obama's great economy and then ruined it, he inherited Obama's great border and destroyed it.
And then what does he do?
Well, here's what's screwy. I'll tell you what story I was telling myself at the time. I was like, oh, it was all New York bluster. You know, we know that these immigrants that are coming are not criminals. And anyway, Trump will probably just go after the criminals, you know, and he probably will strengthen the border for what it's worth. And there probably is a crisis. Well, I was wrong on all three things. There wasn't a crisis. That's the first thing. The second thing was he didn't go after the criminals. So what Trump does is since he hates Obama so much, he issues this executive order and says, I'm not going to prioritize criminals like Obama did. I'm going to prioritize everybody. The woman who's cleaning your toilets has got to go. The pizza delivery guy, he's definitely going to go. You know what else I'm going to do? When people come into the country, I'm going to arrest them. I'm going to charge them with crimes so that I can take their children away from them.
Right.
Because usually what happened was a family came in and there were more families coming. You would say to the whole family, you really don't get to come in here. Sorry, you got to all go back. And he was like, oh no, what I'm going to do is I'm going to arrest the parents so I can kidnap their children, send them to God knows where, and terrorize the immigrant community. I never, to the day I die, I do not understand why the American people did not rise up with one voice. I don't care what your views are, and say, this is a stain on the soul of America. I will never understand that.
Well, there certainly was a lot of outrage from certain people about
Oh,
the
yeah.
family separation policy. There's no doubt about that, including Kamala Harris, who did some really tough questioning at the time. But
Why did we forget that?
Yes,
Why
I
did we
know.
forget that? Okay, I digress. What happened was he put so much energy and resources into terrorizing families and separating them, for which he was immediately sued, and for arresting pizza delivery guys, that when the criminals crossed the border, they did not have the resources to either process them, identify them. They had nowhere to keep them. So what Trump does is he takes the people who are least likely to commit crimes and arrests them and puts them in jail and throws them out. And the convicted criminals flood into the United States because he has no room and no processing infrastructure left to process them. During his time in office, he let 58,000 convicted criminals into the United States. They don't know where they went. They never tracked them. They don't have any idea where they went. And the word got out to criminals everywhere that you could come to the United States and they would let you in. People did Freedom of Information Act and pried this information out of them. And they found that under Trump, the number of convicted criminals he let into the United States went up and up and up, even when the number of people coming into the United States was going down to a certain extent. No matter what Trump did, how bad he was, he cut the number of border agents. No matter what he did, it didn't stop people from coming. The first 2 years it was low, but in 2019, it went up like a rocket. And it was families. And they were from Central America. I mean, the whole composition had changed. He was not ready for it. His people admitted that the border was overrun, that they couldn't handle these people. The only thing that saved Trump from a total catastrophe at the border was COVID. He was able to shut the border down. And the number of families plummets. The one number that does not plummet throughout all of COVID is single adults. And the second number that does not plummet but goes higher is convicted criminals. They stopped more convicted criminals at the border in 2020 than they had ever done in the history of the enforcement agencies. So you know, if the triple the number of criminals are getting caught, you know how many are not getting caught. So now we're in 2021, the era of Biden. When Biden comes into office, the border is a total catastrophe, just like everything else Trump touched. Biden looks at this situation and he sees the numbers. There are more families coming in. And for the first time, you have really huge populations from a certain area of Central America. That region was so unstable at that time. People just needed to get the hell out of there. So Biden sends Kamala Harris to those three countries, Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, to talk to people about what was going on. And she says, the things that are pushing people to the United States, they have been coming for a long time, and there's no quick fix. And she's absolutely right about that. But she brings everybody together, and she gets commitments for over $5 billion from people, from companies and groups, to invest in the infrastructure of those countries to stop that immigration so people feel comfortable staying home. And she's talking to them, and they're working out border deals. Guess what happens? In 2022, the number of people from those countries contracts. And then by 2023, it almost evaporates. So she did a good job, but what they didn't count on was that as the number of people from Mexico went down, the number of people from the Central America went down, the rest of the world was catching on. If we think COVID was bad in our country, it was like a nuclear bomb detonated in the rest of the developing world. I mean, we saw it in Central America. So all of a sudden, for the first time, almost half of the people showing up at the border are not the people that Joe Biden was working very hard to control. Mexican nationals and people from Central America. All of a sudden, you have people from India, you have people from China, you have people from Russia, you have people from Brazil and Haiti and Nicaragua and Venezuela. All of these other countries that are having catastrophic situations with their economies because there are traffickers who are sending social media messages out to them saying, I can get you to the border. And since the United States doesn't have diplomatic relations with half of these countries, you're going to have to let you in because Mexico won't take them. So all of a sudden, the border is flooded with what they call other nationalities, which until then were just a blip. And it got even worse in 2023. Biden saw that, and he tried some fixes. Like he created paroles, what they call them, which is how we got like refugees from Europe in after the Second World War.
Right.
He created these special categories for people who were really Venezuela and Nicaragua
Haitians.
and the Haitians that Trump is hating on so much.
Yeah.
Because Biden saw, okay, we need to have an organized situation for these people. The parole program has money for communities, not enough, but they did have some structure. They could pick out the communities they would go to, whereas at the border, you let them in, you don't know where they're going to go. So he tried, but it was too much. They did not react fast enough. It was like saying, well, we really need rain for our garden, but we don't need a 4-day deluge. We can't handle that.
Right.
I mean, the Republicans were quick to jump on him and say, oh, you've got open borders. Well, the world had open borders. That was the problem. I mean, Biden kicked out about half of the people that came. He kicked out a higher percentage of the people who came than Trump did. It was just that the numbers were so high.
One of the things that I think is really interesting about this is that the impact of a terrible president like Donald Trump many times is not felt for years down the line. The ripple effects of terrible decisions. It reminds me of some of the horrible things that Ronald Reagan did that we just realize when we look back 40 years later. Oh, that started with Reagan. Oh, that started with Reagan. Donald Trump created a terrible immigration situation that had ripple effects throughout Joe Biden's presidency.
Yeah, Joe Biden had to fix, it was like, fixing the plane while you're flying it. Because of COVID and because of the pent-up demand. But, 2020 would have looked like 2019, except much worse if it hadn't been for COVID. Trump would have been faced with an immense surge of people at his border, but COVID interrupted that. And it just picked up when Biden got in 2021. And he was trying to deal with the problem at hand, but then the problem changed. And, you can't discount the effect of social media, where traffickers were sending people messages, basically saying, I will fly you to Latin America and you can make your way up to the border of the United States. And I think they're going to let you in. And when you're desperate, you'll grab at any straw.
All this said, this is a fixable problem.
This is a fixable problem. After the first time we talked, and I went back and did a little bit of research, actually, lots of research. I got papers all over the place here. It was very clear to me after 10 days that this is very fixable. I don't care what they say. Oh, it's an insoluble problem. No, it isn't. I mean, come on.
We put a man on the moon, right? I mean,
we put a man on the moon. We can micro-target a voter,
right,
to their social media, what they watch on social media, and give them an ad that plays over and over. We found that out, recently. Well, you know what? Good for them. Don't tell me we can't fix this problem. There are a couple of things that you could do. But the first thing you got to do is figure out what the hell you want to accomplish. The problem will remain unsolvable until we agree on what the hell we want to accomplish. Some people say you should have no immigrants. They're all criminals and crooks. And those people, I don't know what to tell you. You're just wrong. But then if you think that immigration is basically a good thing for America, and that's one fact you have to deal with. The second fact you have to deal with is people will come here. Regardless of what you do at the border, they will find a way in here. So you have to make sure that the most people come here through a legal process, which will be very helpful for the countries to be able to absorb people. Immigration is a push-pull, right? People say it's all Joe Biden's fault. No, it isn't. Joe Biden could have open borders, and, if people weren't desperate, they wouldn't come here.
Right.
As long as they're desperate people and economies that don't work and governments that are in chaos, people will come here. I mean, we know that from all over the world. The whole world is in motion right now because of failed governments. We're not going to be immune from that.
Right.
But most of our immigration is usually coming from our own backyard. in
Right.
places where we have a hand in creating the problem.
Yeah.
And don't tell me America doesn't know how to make investments that stick. They do. First, you have to decide what you want. Then the solution is easy. I mean, I figured that out in about 3 days. So then the second question you have to ask is, if it would really be easy to fix, why isn't it fixed?
The fact that our immigration system is designed with such a lack of intentionality that it does not have the infrastructure or capacity to deal with the reality on the ground leads me to no other conclusion than it's actually working as intended for some people, isn't it?
It must be. It must be. So you do what you usually do in these situations and you follow the money. If you look at like the history of, our own family, right? People who are working the mines, for example, in the 1800s, they get the worst jobs, the dirtiest jobs, the least paying jobs, and they're in a situation where they can be easily exploited. Now, people in the 19th century were here legally. They didn't have deportation hanging over their heads. But it's the same idea. It's an endless pool of incredibly cheap labor for jobs that the people who live here don't want because they don't pay enough and they're very dangerous and they're horrible and the hours are insane. Who does that benefit? It benefits the people who are big enough to hide that kind of population in their corporations and benefit from them because they know they will never complain because they live in terror of being deported. So yes, it benefits those people and they need to be called out. The second people it benefits, Donald Trump's thing benefits private prisons. The stock went up insanely when he was elected. Made me sorry I hadn't bought some. I take it back. I don't think I would have. Well, maybe I would have. I would have given the money to immigrant organizations.
Yeah.
Yeah. Who benefits? If you don't think this is a thing, you should read the history of labor. The one thing that's really clear is that it's like a safety valve. When you need cheap labor, you make all these noises about hating immigrants, but you let them in. And when the economy contracts, which it always does, you have an excellent scapegoat because you definitely need a scapegoat for, the economic chaos that is caused by oligarchy and monopoly, which we're having in spades these days. Immigrants are a perfect punching bag. Look at those immigrants who are, trying to steal your little cookie when I have 10,000 cookies and you can't have any.
Right.
The thing is, it
Now-
works every time.
Yeah, it works every time. Getting back to the difference between the narrative and the facts on the ground,
Right.
the story that Donald Trump sold, that the Republicans sold, was these immigrants are coming, they're criminals, they're taking jobs from you, they're leeching off of the government. You
Right.
did some research into both legal immigrants and undocumented immigrants on what their actual impact is on the economy.
Oh my God. Oh my God. The economists, in their very polite way, are absolutely freaked out at the idea of cutting back on immigration. Absolutely terrified. If you just took undocumented immigrants in this country, I just did the numbers. The idea that they don't pay any taxes is like crazy. Do they buy groceries? Do they buy shoes? Even if they're all on cash, they pay taxes. They pay sales taxes. Do they rent
Yeah.
an apartment? Well, the landlord pays property taxes. Come on. But we all know, if you're my age, that people have their little tricks to get W-2 income. And undocumented workers, I looked at the studies. If you take it from 2024 to 2034, they will pay into Social Security $250 billion. And then I thought, okay, how much would billionaires pay into Social Security? So I did that calculation too, because there are about 800 billionaires in the United States. They would pay $167 million into Social Security over 10 years. Wow, that's a lot of money. Meanwhile, here's the poor person who's cleaning your toilets will never, ever benefit from Social Security. They're just paying in. $250 billion. And if you take all undocumented workers, all immigrants, excuse me, over that period of time, they will pay $2 trillion just into Social Security. So, I mean, who's the leech here? I mean, the other thing, I mean, if you just want to go by the numbers, it's going to add $9 trillion to the gross domestic product. It's going to lower the deficit by almost $1 trillion. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. From the federal government's point of view, it's a big windfall because of all the taxes that immigrants pay. And the other thing that they do when they have that money, they send that money back to their families in these countries. And so the families are more financially secure and they don't feel like they have to immigrate here. If you just want to be really hard-nosed about it, they call them remittances.
Yeah.
You know, we saw that in Honduras. It was one of the main sources of income for a lot of time, was people in the United States sending money back. And I'll tell you, people don't want to come here.
Right.
Most of them. Who thinks that a lady from Guatemala who's, you know, speaks Mayan and whose family has lived in the area for 1,000 years is going to put her life savings in the hand of a coyote to come to America unless things are so terrible that they can't think of any way forward? They don't mostly want to come here. The ones who do want to come here are very poor, but I'll tell you, they are the bravest people. They're the hardest working people. They're the most ambitious people. Once they make that decision, you should be happy to have most of those people in this country.
When we talk about the border, quote unquote, we're always focused on the southern border. We're always focused on people coming from Mexico, Central America. But
Right.
there are a lot of people here, quote unquote, illegally who don't make it that way.
Oh my God, this was one of the things that I did not expect when I was looking this stuff up. People do study this. They found out that almost half of the undocumented people in this country came through airports with visas. They just never left.
Right.
And right now, the undocumented population of 11 million, 40% of them came in here by overstaying their visas. I
Right.
did not expect to see that. And I also didn't expect to see that the government has no way of tracking them or doesn't track them, especially since 2 of the 9/11 hijackers had overstayed their visas. That to me is crazy. If you really were serious about cutting down so-called illegal immigrants, you would do a better job of figuring out where all those visas are.
Right. And it gives the game away a little bit because
Yeah, it does.
it's when you hear about mass deportation, you don't hear about anyone saying, you know what we need to do is track down all those people who've overstayed their visas and send them back. That's not what
No.
you're hearing about.
Well, if you have the money to fly into an airport, you probably have more wealth than most people. I mean, that's in a way what gives the game away. I mean, some of these visas are students. Some of them come on temporary work visas. Some are just tourists. But there's money there. And so there's no will to expel those people because the Republicans are looking at them, those are our people. They're all going to come in, become citizens, and then become Republicans. We're happy to have those people. We won't even talk about them.
Right.
But here you are.
Elon Musk was one of those people.
Yeah, he overstayed his visa because he didn't go to Stanford when he's supposed to, and he wasn't allowed to work, but he did anyway.
Send him back.
Yeah, send him back. Send him back. And he said, well, you know, it's a gray area. I'm like, well, gray to you, pal. You know,
Yeah.
not
The
to
fact
most of
is
us.
that if you got some wealth, you can jump ahead of the line in the legal immigration process as it exists today.
Well, you can do that even without overstaying your visa. You can buy a business and, you know, you staff it for 3 years. You can't use your immediate family, but you could use your relatives. And you just have a little business for 3 years, and then you get a green card, and then you get to be a citizen. It's called the millionaire's visa. Yeah, we like those kind of people, right? You won't see that getting cut back, but forget about those poor people from Ukraine. You know, we like them for a minute, but we don't like them anymore. The last thing I'm going to say about economic impact, which I think is important, is that the federal government makes out like a bandit on immigrants. The state governments, not so much. Because when immigrants come in, they generally don't go over all 50 states. There are about 6 states that have the vast majority of them. I mean, you could guess what they are: California, Texas, Florida, New York, Georgia, North Carolina. Those communities are not set up to absorb so many people so quickly, especially because this population tends to be poor. And I think that the answer to that is, number one, you have to have way more money to ease the transition. Number two, you have to talk to people. How many communities would have been who were really impacted by this surge in immigration would have felt a lot better about it if the federal government had come with money and talked to the people in the community and said, listen, I talked to your mayor. He said that you need the labor, but I understand that you're struggling. Can we enlist you to help ease their transition into becoming good Americans? Why didn't anybody do that?
I mean, it's almost like having a sensible immigration policy would be the way to go to deal with some of the challenges that come with immigration. There are challenges to absorbing immigration that can be addressed.
Yes.
And you can get the benefits and minimize any of the challenges. But to do that, you need to tell a story about your vision of America that includes the contributions of immigrants and show how those contributions aren't just taking away from American citizens, but they are benefiting all of us. You talked about how immigrants contribute to Social Security. It also turns out one of the biggest jobs that they have is that they're home health care workers for elderly people. They're taking care of our grandparents. Let's take a look at what Donald Trump's message was, unfortunately, so that we can point out some of the myths that they are based on. This is essentially what Donald Trump was saying about immigration. He had the Haitians are eating your cats and dogs. So that's just straight racism and xenophobia. That's the main pillar here that this is based on. But he's also making economic arguments. They're basically blaming every problem in America on immigrants. So housing costs, that's because there are too many immigrants. They're driving up the cost of housing. They're taking your jobs. They're taking your benefits. They're bringing crime.
Right.
So let's just look at some of those things. Crime. Immigrants commit far less crime than native-born citizens. In fact, I looked up some data. The group that commits the fewest crime, undocumented immigrants.
Right.
Which, of course, makes sense. If you're going to be coming into this country for a better life for yourself, the last thing you're going to do is draw attention to yourself by committing crimes.
Right.
If you wanted to address crime in America, you would actually probably want to let in a whole lot more undocumented immigrants because it would bring the crime rate down.
Right.
Do they take jobs? Actually, it turns out that unemployment goes down with immigration. Do they drive down the cost of wages? Turns out that no, it actually raises the wages. The big lie that Donald Trump's message was built upon is a zero-sum understanding of the economy. There's only so many jobs. There's only so many cookies on the plate. But we don't think about the contributions that immigrants make. There are instances where, an immigrant may take a job and a native-born American citizen may say, that job could have gone to me, but they don't think about the fact that now that person's a consumer. They're going to be buying things at your restaurant or your store. There's this zero-sum mentality that I think has been drilled into us from birth immigration can be a way for everyone to benefit.
I agree with that. And I think what you're saying about the story is they're coming here and taking your jobs.
Uh-huh.
Okay. I didn't know so many Americans wanted to pick strawberries, clean toilets, rake people's yards, wash their dishes, watch for their grandparents. I didn't know that. And it turns out most of those jobs are jobs that you cannot fill with native borns. They just don't want those jobs. They've tried. But let's just say they're taking some American jobs in there. Let's just say that they are. Is that the end of the story? Well, it's not exactly the end of the story because they're paying billions of dollars toward my Social Security and my Medicare and your unemployment insurance, and they will never be able to take advantage of any of those things. So they're propping up these systems that they'll never be able to take advantage of. We should be happy about it. And then they take the rest of their money, which they didn't pay in taxes, and they go to the grocery store and they go to the nail salon and they go to the dentist or whatever they could, and they put money back into the economy. So then those people go, wow, there's so many immigrants here and they're all shopping at my grocery store. And now I can hire more Americans to work here. And then they make more money and they pay taxes. I mean, it's not just they're taking your jobs and that's the end of it. The jobs that they take, they still pay tons, millions, billions, and billions of dollars into the economy.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not saying that immigrants don't take American jobs. I don't know what the statistics are. I mean, that's a factual question. I understand the fear, but I don't understand the facts.
Yeah. I mean, based on what I've looked at, I know for certain that I'm sure, and you have to contend with this when you're dealing with political messaging. I'm sure that there are going to be instances where immigrants get jobs that native-born Americans wish they had, and they
Right.
see an immigrant in a job that they're like, I didn't get that job. I'm sure that happens.
Right.
The data that I've seen is that immigration, including, quote unquote, illegal immigration, drives unemployment rates down. So in the big, broad picture
Yeah.
of the economy, it doesn't lead to higher levels of unemployment. It doesn't even lead to lower levels of wages. What I do know when we're talking about political messaging about who's actually pretty happy about having a bunch of undocumented workers in America are big businesses
Yeah.
that can take advantage of them because those people have no one to complain to. And the corporation can use the threat of calling ICE to keep them quiet.
Yeah. It's the same strategy that they use for everything, which is first you demonize the group and kind of loosen people up to accept the message. Then you find one instance of somebody who loses their job. That's not just the rotten apple in the barrel. All of the apples in the barrel are rotten. Every single immigrant now becomes someone who's taking your job. Just like you find one person who's spying for the Communist Party, or, for the communists, and then everybody in that group, every Jew, for example, is a communist. You just make the leap from one rotten apple to the whole barrel being rotten. It's very easy because people are so primed to want simple explanations and somebody to blame and somebody to put their foot on the neck of. It rears its ugly head every 30 years or so. Every time there's economic dislocation, every time there's racial unrest, it has to have a place to land. And once it lands there, boy, people never let go.
One of the cornerstones of this anti-immigrant rhetoric and story is to make people afraid of other cultures, of course.
Yeah.
That always seems so strange to me, but I'm realizing that's because of the circumstances that I grew up in. I grew up in Inglewood, California, probably majority Black. The next largest demographic is Latino. And then there was me, my sister, and my brother at school as the white kids, maybe one or two others when I was growing up. But this meant that a lot of our friends were Mexican, and I've been to my fair share of quinceañeras, and Let me tell you, Mexican culture is amazing. The food is great. The music is great. People are nice. There's nothing about Latino people coming into America that scares me about the culture that they would bring. But of course, the cultures of every immigrant group has become a part of the American story over time. Do you see what they do on St. Patrick's Day in Boston? You know,
Yeah, of course. They turn the beer
that's
green.
that's Irish heritage, but now it's part of American culture. That's
Right.
There's nothing to be afraid of.
Now,
In fact, I live in LA and I can get Japanese food, go to Little Ethiopia, go to Thai Town. Different cultures enrich America. They nourish it. Immigration nourishes America.
yeah, that's true. And I think you were very fortunate in growing up. I really wanted my family to grow up in a multicultural environment. At that time when I moved to LA, housing was very segregated. And I was very happy to be able to move into a multicultural neighborhood. And I've always thought that it was much easier, ironically, to be white in a multicultural neighborhood than the other way around.
Right. Yeah.
I found people so generous and accepting. And, you have to be a little bit even surprised by that in a way, with all of the obstacles that they had, within living memory.
The thing that I think really gives the game away is that the same people who sell this anti-immigration narrative are also extremely concerned about American birth rates. So you've got freaks like Elon Musk and the next vice president, J.D. Vance, talking about civilizational collapse because of our lower birth rates. The idea, of course, is that you need these higher birth rates because you need to inject that human energy into the economy, right? You need people to become workers. You need people to become consumers. If you're having a low birth rate, there's a pretty simple answer to that problem. It's called immigration. But the
Yeah.
reason they don't want that answer is because they're white supremacists.
Yeah, that's why. I don't know why kids are not having kids. I suspect it has something to do with they can't afford it.
Yeah.
Childcare is incredibly expensive. We don't make it easy for people to be parents.
No.
If you want a higher birth rate, then support families for real. Help them with childcare. That's the single biggest thing. Make healthcare more affordable for people. Then maybe they would feel comfortable enough to have kids.
During the run-up to the election, during the Haitian immigrant lies, they said they were all illegal immigrants. Of course, they had temporary protected status. They were legal immigrants. But there were these right-wing freaks, influencers on YouTube going around and interviewing impoverished white Americans to get their take on the Haitian immigrants. They would talk about how they couldn't get food stamps or benefits because all the Haitian immigrants were stealing them.
Do you feel like the Haitians or kind of the influx of the Haitian immigrants are taking away from resources that you could potentially have?
100%.
So-
We got to fight for our money, our food stamps, our medical, everything. We got to fight for it, but they get to come here and just get it handed to them. That's not fair to my daughter.
Which, of course, is not how those programs work. Those were the things that they believed because they had bought into a lot of the propaganda themselves. But one of the horrible ironies I felt about this is that all of this propaganda was used to support a party who wants to cut welfare, who wants to cut food stamps, who wants to cut the social safety net. So the Republican Party and Donald Trump was inferring a message that immigrants are stealing your benefits, but they're the party that wants to take away the benefits across the board for everybody.
Yeah, well, that's scapegoating. It's two things. Number one, it's scapegoating. Poor Americans who are barely getting by really want someone to blame. And so it's very convenient to blame immigrants, even though immigrants have nothing to do with it. And it doesn't work that way. If you're eligible for a program, you're eligible for the program. People really need to blame somebody when things are bad. They really need to feel like it's not their fault, that it's somebody else's fault. And the Republicans have been geniuses at deflect and distract. I'm going to tell you a quick story that kind of makes that point. When you were about 3.5, 4 years old, and your brother was in a high chair, kind of falling asleep and, just flopping in his high chair, and you knocked over your milk. And without missing a beat, you looked at me and said, "Look what Daniel did."
Right.
You weren't going to take any heat, but you felt like you were going to take heat for it. So you're like, "Look what he did." And that it's like, "Look what Daniel did." My life is terrible. Look what those immigrants are doing to me.
Yeah.
And I really fault the Democratic Party. It is their fault. It lands right in their laps that people feel this way, that they feel like their government doesn't take care of them. Why don't you stop, thinking that people watch the news all day, which they don't because they don't have time. They just listen to some hot take that takes 10 seconds that can fit on a bumper sticker. Republicans have always been genius at that. I know that from when I was a little right-wing person. You just find these emotional triggers. And, people want to blame somebody for their plight in life. I kind of get this, kind of human. It's just, look what Daniel did. That's what it is. It's like, and I fault the Democratic Party for that. And, I will tell you one thing. People are up in arms about that in the Democratic sphere. They're sick of how, antediluvian their party is. And people are going to do something about it. But that's who I blame. I don't blame the people.
Even if you have communities that are facing challenges because of immigration, you could point to the billionaires who are hiring undocumented people and make them the villain.
You could. You could also say, you don't have food stamps because we can't pay for it because we're giving billionaires tax cuts so they can buy another yacht. And then there isn't enough money left over to give you food stamps and give you a job training program and provide you with housing you can afford. We don't have the money. We gave it all to Elon Musk and all his merry, band of thieves.
What would happen to the economy if Trump gets his way and is able to implement mass deportation?
Well, for one thing, the amount of money that it would cost. I mean, they've already studied the amount of money. For the amount of money that it would cost, you could have health care for all in this country. Everybody could have a good job. Everybody could have housing that was affordable for the money that it was going to cost, because it's upward in the trillions of dollars. It would be a catastrophe. I mean, it would be an absolute catastrophe. In California, whereas 27% of the state is foreign born, which I think is a plus. The one of the most prosperous states in the country, like one of the biggest economies in the world, 35% of nurses are foreign born. 48% of home health care workers, the people who will eventually take care of me, are foreign born. And they're entrepreneurs and they bring innovative ideas and they're clever. I mean, we get the best and brightest, usually, of people. I don't care he calls them, polluting our gene pool or all that Nazi propaganda stuff that he talks about. We get the smartest. We get the best and the brightest. We get the most brave, the most enthusiastic, the most hardworking, the cleverest people who are damned sure they're going to succeed. If you take that away from the country, I mean, if nothing else, the country will collapse because the birth rate has collapsed. If we didn't have immigrants to foster the birth rate, the country would be extinct itself. Even if you're a terrible person and you don't like immigrants, I'm going to tell you, you would be in hot water without immigrants.
You know, I don't want to lay this all on Kamala. She only had 100 days, but I will bring Joe Biden and the Democratic Party into this because they did not have a counter narrative. They were offering a Republican light version of the narrative where they're like, yeah, we want to be really tough on the border. Trust us. Donald Trump won't let us do it. They didn't have an affirmative case or a counter narrative. And I know you don't want to spend, you see Donald Trump talking about Haitians eating cats and dogs, and you don't want to waste your time or get in the muck, but you needed to point out that all of these were lies.
Well,
Donald
you don't
Trump-
have to. You don't have to. Democrats have the problem of wasting their time chasing the latest lie, and by the time they've done chase that lie, there's another one that's a big whopper that's even bigger. You don't chase the lie; you chase the hate behind it. You say you're trying to divide us with these stupid lies. It's the oldest trick in the book to divide Americans against each other, to make us hate each other, to make us be afraid. We are not a nation of cowards, and you're making us a nation of cowards. You're making us a nation of fraidy cats who are afraid of our own shadow. We're not that way. Stop it.
And that's why I feel like the counter narrative to Donald Trump's hate needs to be an affirmative case about the humanity of immigrants and the contributions that immigrants and immigration makes to everybody in America.
You have to see them as human beings. You have to see your story in them. The bravery, the cleverness, the entrepreneurial spirit, the desire to work hard, the desire to make something of yourself. That's what you have to see when you see them. Start with the fact that these are human beings who are really coming here just like the Statue of Liberty, yearning to be free, the tempest-tossed, the climate refugees, the people fleeing political violence in an increasingly unstable, Americas. That's your starting point. Then you figure out what your rules are going to be, according to your own needs. But you do it with facts and information, and also with the premise that the people that you let in, assuming that you vet people correctly, are going to be a benefit to your country. You start with that, not with the idea that you're just letting in, it's like they emptied the prisons and they're sending them to America.
The truth is that unless your ancestors are indigenous or were brought here in chains, or I suppose you were one of the original colonizers, if you're in America, you're either an immigrant or the descendant of an immigrant. The vast majority of Americans are the descendants of immigrants.
Yes. And they have a story just like mine.
Going forward, one of the things about this administration that really frightens me the most is the possibility of Donald Trump carrying out mass deportations, because I truly believe that could rip this country apart.
It will rip the country apart. It will even rip the country apart of the people who supported him, who didn't think this would happen to them. And all I can say to you is, you're next.
It's like that poem, At first they came for the communists and I said nothing because I wasn't a communist,
Yeah.
Like, it's vital to protect the most vulnerable because they don't stop there. They come for the next group and the next group.
They will never stop there. And to some extent, it comes down to the story that you tell yourself when you see the pictures of hundreds of people at the border. And if you say to yourself, what I see are drug dealers, drug pushers, criminals, lazy people who want to come and take our benefits and do nothing, you don't see human beings. You just see others. You just see parasites. And if that's what you're being told over and over and over again, then eventually it just seeps into your brain and that's what you see. And what I think is you need to turn that story upside down on its head because it makes no sense. Who would flee a drug-infested, war-torn country, walk thousands of miles, pay their life savings to a coyote, risk their lives and their kids' lives to cross the border and commit a crime, to cross the border and sit on their ass and try to get benefits which they're not going to get because they're not entitled to. If they're undocumented, they don't get Medicare, they don't get Medicaid, they don't get food stamps, they don't get welfare. When you look at those people, what you need to see, the story you need to tell yourself, is the story of your family's journey to this country. Your family, whoever you are out there. However many generations ago, they came here not to come here and sit on their ass. They didn't come here to commit crimes. They came here because they knew that this was their only hope, that they didn't want their kids to have the life that they had, that they wanted to have a better life. Those hordes of people at the border, are the bravest, the smartest, the most clever, the most interesting, the most entrepreneurial. The ones who come here who want to love this country, who want to give to this country. They are the ones you want. You want them to come. They're not lazy. I mean, are some of them lazy? I mean, human beings are lazy. Are there some criminals in there? Of course there are. We would be stupid to not think there are, and even maybe people from organized drug rings. But still, you can go into a football stadium on a Sunday afternoon, and I guarantee you got lazy people there, you got criminals there, you got drug dealers there. I mean, it's just human beings. Of course, there are some. You will always find one instance in any group who's a bad apple. And the secret of a demagogue is to say, every apple in that barrel is bad. He's just one, but you could have picked any one of them, and they'd all be the same. But in order to do that, you have to have a long history of demonizing those people. And you have to have a receptive audience who doesn't, who have that devil that comes up in the human heart every 30 years or every 40 years. You don't like people who aren't like you. You don't like people who don't worship like you. You don't like people who look different from you, who speak a different language than you. You just don't like them. You're afraid of them.
Yeah.
If you didn't have that getting pulled out of the depths of the bad part of the human soul, none of those stories would stick. And I would say that people like me who are very comfortable in our retirement, what is our stake in this? Our stake is that we have a moral compass. As a Catholic, I have a moral compass. It's not because it's particularly in my self-interest. Maybe it is, but I don't see it that way. I was naked and you clothed me. I was hungry and you fed me. That's the command of our faith. Our faith tells us that we are to be good Samaritans, to pick up the hated person from the ditch and take care of them. That's our moral responsibility. And whether you're religious or not, as Americans, we cannot accept this story. We cannot accept the demonization of people who are weak. Who are not in a position of power. We cannot accept it. It's un-American. Whatever you think about who should get in and who shouldn't, and what America carrying capacity is for immigrants, which is another discussion that we desperately need to have, because the last one we really had was like 35 years ago, long before the internet, long before cell phones were prevalent, long before oligarchs started to rule the world. We need a completely different analysis now, but whatever that is, you have to start with looking at people in the eye and saying, these are human beings just like me. That's the starting point. That's the narrative we have to accept. When we solve the problem, we have to do it from that perspective, not from the perspective of, like that article said, rattlesnakes are better than they are. How dare you? Don't ever forget, 100 years ago, this was your family.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to be on the defensive for a while in this Trump administration. Prop 187 was a precursor to what we're seeing today in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And it was a terrible, terrible law. But there was also another aspect of it that might provide us with a little bit more hope for the future.
Yeah, well, let's finish the end of that story. California passes overwhelmingly this law that says I have to produce your birth certificate before you can go to school. And cops have to turn in people they suspect of being here without papers. Well, the Latino community in California did not take that sitting down. They started to organize in their communities, and they actually turned the Latino vote around. It was actually in favor of that proposition until the Latino organizations started telling people the truth about what it would do, and then it cratered among them. Right before it passed, tens of thousands of high school kids walked out of their classes in Los Angeles and San Diego and the Bay Area and all over the state to protest what was going to happen to their communities. And it happened after it was passed. And then the Asian community realized they were probably next. And so their organizations all joined in this whole coalition to stop this from ever taking place. And they went to court with the ACLU and a whole bunch of organizations to stop this law from taking effect. And they won. The upshot of it was it created a whole generation of Latino activists who to this day are in big state offices and are activists and are changing the face of the state. And it also was the end of the Republican Party in California. 2 years later, they lost their majority in one of the state houses, and they never got it back. And right now, registered Republicans in California are number 3 behind decline to state. And it was not just Latinos, it was their allies, like me, who were disgusted by this, who were outraged by this, who just thought it was un-American to do this. So the message to me is, you are strong when you fight back. It's not just being on the defensive. We have to take the offensive against this. We have to understand that we almost won and that there are 75 million people who said no to Trump. And we have a tremendous amount of power because we are angry. And we are not going to go on the defensive. We're going to go on the offensive against this guy. And it all starts with you joining hands with your neighbors and saying, no, just no. You do not have to be a bystander in this story. You can change the story you tell yourself when you look at people at the border, because it does not have to be this way. It's only this way if we let it be this way. And what I'm going to say to you is, regardless of what your views are, when you look at the people who are coming to the border, remember your own origin story. Remember the courage of your ancestors. Remember that those people at the border are brave beyond measure, and that they are human beings coming here for the exact same reason that your family came here 100 years ago or 200 years ago. Do not do to them what was done to you. Do not take away their dignity. Whatever else they are human beings worthy of our respect. And there is not, you can write a letter to your senator or your governor. That's something you can do. Can you teach? Can you, help with rides? Can you help people get organized? Can you just knock on somebody's door and say, welcome to the neighborhood? You are not alone. Claim your humanity at the same time that you help people claim theirs.
Well, I think that's a great place to leave it, Mom. Thank you so much,
Okay.
and we'll talk soon.
Love you.
Love you too.
Bye.
Okay, so we're not quite done yet. I want to briefly comment on the civil war going on right now between conservatives. Quick recap. According to CBS News, the debate touched off this week when Laura Loomer, a right-wing influencer with a history of racist and conspiratorial comments, criticized Trump's selection of Sriram Krishnan as an advisor on artificial intelligence policy in his coming administration. Krishnan favors the ability to bring more skilled immigrants into the U.S. Loomer declared the stance to be not America First policy and said the tech executives who had aligned themselves with Trump were doing so to enrich themselves. So then Vivek Ramaswamy weighs in on Twitter with this lengthy tweet talking smack about American culture and pointing to that as the reason why tech companies are hiring more foreign-born and first-generation engineers. And the backlash was swift. I guess Vivek didn't realize that on the right, you are only allowed to attack the lazy culture of black people and Latinos. I guess he didn't realize that his role in the right-wing media ecosystem is that of a minority who can launder racist talking points for them so they can espouse the same talking points with plausible deniability. But anyway, this whole discussion is centered around H-1B visas. Here's how the Department of Labor describes the program. The intent of the H-1B provisions is to help employers who cannot otherwise obtain needed business skills and abilities from the U.S. workforce by authorizing the temporary employment of qualified individuals who are not otherwise authorized to work in the United States. So then Elon Musk decides to jump in and says on Twitter, there's a dire shortage of extremely talented and motivated engineers. Though I suspect the reason he likes the program is because it's how he got into the country. That, and of course, it provides him a source of cheap labor. He tweets at another point, there is a permanent shortage of excellent engineering talent. It is the fundamental limiting factor in Silicon Valley. And then the MAGA base jumps on him, often fueled with anti-Indian racist invective. And then a pro-Musk freak account called Autism Capital summarizes the whole fight. So basically, the right split into two factions, tech right and right right. And the tech right is like, hey, we need H-1B visa people to do the jobs. And the right right was like, no, you need to hire Americans. And the tech right is like, but you guys are R slur. And the right right is like, well, you don't train us. And the tech right is like, you can't out-train being R slur. And while all this was going on, we learned some people really don't like Indians. To which Musk replied, that pretty much sums it up. This was eye-opening. And then Trump, who had limited the program in his previous administration and been critical of it in the past, decides to back Elon because Elon's his daddy. And he says, I've always liked the visas. I've always been in favor of the visas. That's why they have them. Adding, I have many H-1B visas on my properties. I'm a believer in H-1B. I've used it many times. It's a great program. And I'm sure there are more updates since all this has happened, but here are my basic thoughts about what all this reveals. It reveals the grift at the heart of the demonization of immigrants that the right wing has used to gain political power. Because at its heart, it's always been using nativist fears and racism in order to support policies that specifically benefit the ultra-rich. That's what it's always been. The right wing thought that they could use this anti-immigration rhetoric as a sword to achieve their political gains, but it's a lot more like a fire. They set a fire and now the fire is out of control. Trump sold them this story about how immigrants were coming and taking their jobs, and then supports a program that probably most closely resembles that actual story in the H-1B visa program. If you were going to portray an immigration policy that represents the idea of stealing American jobs, highly sought after, well-paying jobs, that would be the program you would demonize. And yet that's the one that Elon Musk and Donald Trump are supporting. They sold their base a bunch of lies, and now their base feels betrayed. And they should, because it was always bullshit. And I find it just rich that Elon is suddenly so shocked about the racism in the party. He has been stoking this racism for years. They were always only going to support policies that they could take advantage of so that they could continue to hoard more and more wealth. Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and Larry Ellison have more wealth than the bottom half of Americans. That's 3 people. They stoked racist fears for profit. They fanned the flames of nativism and xenophobia, and that fire is now out of control, and they can't even control it. And so it's time for the left to divide and conquer for once and reveal that the Republican immigration demonization was always only in service of the wealthy elite. And it's those wealthy elite, they are the people who are actually stealing your jobs, your benefits, lowering your pay, increasing the cost of housing, responsible for inflation, you name it. It's time for the left to present their own affirmative vision for immigration in America. And it's a vision that I think should also include protections for American workers. If everyone in America had a living wage, free health care, and a guaranteed job, there would be a lot less fuel to ignite the anti-immigrant sentiment. But the truth is, there are plenty of cookies to go around for both native-born and immigrants alike. And the reason you don't have what you need to get by is not because the immigrant is taking from you. It's because people like Vivek Ramaswamy, Elon Musk, and Donald Trump have hoarded all the cookies for themselves. All right, now we're really done. That was a long episode, so thank you for sticking with us, and thank you for watching Talking Politics with Mom. Remember, please subscribe, comment, fight in the YouTube comments respectfully, but it's good for the algorithm, so make sure that you tell us what you think, and please consider supporting us on Patreon. That would be amazing. We love you, and we'll see you soon.